Well, good morning, everybody. It is Saturday morning at 11 a.m. And you know what that means. It means that it is time for House Talk Pregame. I am your sports mental health empowerment coach, Dr. Lauren Pitts. Got with me this morning, Ronnie Ransom and Carla Debro with us. Yo, it's some madness going on during March Madness. What the heck is going on? We're going to talk about that in a few minutes because it has been all types of craziness going on around March Madness. But look, folks, welcome to HT Pregame. Yet again, we are so happy to be back with you this morning. And if this is your first time tuning in to see what's going on with us, let me just give you a little bit of background about what HT Pregame is all about. So, look, we are all about sports and mental health. Why? Because craziness is real, y'all. It's real. And we were talking about it before we came live, and there's a whole lot of stuff. Look, fans are unstable. We got some scholar athletes that's got some questioning going on. But on a serious note, we take sports and mental health very, very seriously because we here at HT Pregame understand that it's not just about the individual scholar or professional athlete. It's about that systemic domino effect of what the sports world looks like within the context of mental health, and how is that impacting the scholar athlete, the team, the whole athletic environment, the family, the community, the world. I mean, let's face it, everybody on fire right now because it's March Madness. Folk are watching this tournament. I got to ask you too, Ronnie, because I forgot. The last thing that I saw was Virginia Tech and Florida going into overtime, and I don't even know who won the game because I was gone.
Let me look it up for you.
Yeah, please. I need to know what the deal was with that because that game was crazy, and I'm like, oh, it's gonna come back, and then it went into overtime, and I didn't get to see any more scores after that. So look, folks, here's the deal. This is what we want you to know. Week after week here at Pregame, we shine light on our historically Black colleges and universities, and we pride ourselves on providing tons of valuable information to help you, your family, heck, our own families, because you know we don't just live in a bubble. It's us and our families, student and professional athletes and their families, and we have much, much, much love for our Heritage Sports Radio Network family, and we encourage you to tune into us. If you don't catch us on Facebook Live, you can catch us on HSRN at this same time at 11 a.m. on Saturdays, at 10 p.m. on Saturdays, and at 6 p.m. on Sundays. All you have to do is go to the App Store, get the app, download it. You can listen to us pretty much whenever you want to. This is what we want you to know. The sports and mental health information that we are sharing on the show every week is needed. It is needed to help you to make well-informed athletic and life-transforming decisions. We want you to be a part of this conversation. So whether you tune in via Facebook Live or you're emailing us at htpregame@gmail.com, we want to hear from you. We want to know that these conversations matter, because this is what we all know to be true, is that 9 times out of 10, matter of fact, 10 times out of 10, at some point in time during the week, we're going to hear something in the media that has to do, in part or holistically, about what we're talking about on this show. And we're peeling back the layers on it. So we want you to be a part of these conversations. We want to know that we're positively impacting your life. Ronnie, what we giving them today? Our guns are loaded today. Oh, they loaded.
We got a lot to talk about. But before I get into what we're talking about today, just 2 quick announcements. First and foremost, I want to give a special happy birthday shout out to my mother, Miss Mary Ransom. Today's her birthday, first day of spring. So happy birthday to her. I'm going to see her and cook dinner for her this afternoon. Got some Cajun chicken Alfredo coming this afternoon. I can Uber eat y'all a plate if y'all want one.
Yes.
And then my second shout out is to our own co-host, Jared Johnson of Bowie State. The team he's coaching, Garfield High School in Northern Virginia, they won last night. They're 4-0 on the season. They beat the brakes off the team. I want to say they played North Stafford. They won 34-0. So
nice.
4-0 on the season. I believe they got 2 games left before the playoffs. So, special shout out to Jared and his team.
Yes.
keep coaching them and get to the playoffs and let's see what happens, man. So like we said, we got an action-packed show today. The NCAA has given us a lot of talking material for today. So the title for today's show is athleticism or slavery. So we want to explore, are Black athletes getting exploited by the NCAA as African Americans are being exploited by slave masters and slave traders back in the 1800s and Jim Crow era as well? And who gets all the profit from these athletes, going out there risking their bodies every single week on the football field or every couple nights on the basketball court? Who's getting this profit? And as a Black student athlete, should I run away from this, or what should I do? And what was somebody like maybe Harriet Tubman or, Thurgood Marshall or Frederick Douglass, what was somebody from back then say about how Black student athletes are being treated in today's time? On top of, like I said, the NCAA has clearly, not only are they subjecting, just Black student athletes to, just injustices and things like that, specifically this week, the women's NCAA tournament. I mean, you talking about not reading the room properly.
Yeah.
NCAA, we got some explaining to do. So we're going to get on all those topics today, on top of me and Dr. Pitts also presenting mental health tips of this week. Dr. Pitts, are you shouting out any Black-owned businesses?
I am not shouting out any Black-owned businesses today.
All right. So look, guys, if you're listening and you have Black-owned businesses or any organizations that you want us to highlight or shout out, please reach out to htpregame@gmail.com. Or please, hop on Facebook on the live and you leave it in the comments, and we will definitely shout it out during this show or next week's show. We want to be able to support Black-owned businesses. Please let us know they're out there. We know there are plenty out there who are still trudging through this pandemic. Yep. There seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel here. Not sure yet, but look, we got to keep these businesses going. We got to be able to support our own. So we got a lot to talk about. So Dr. Pitts, do you want to get into your mental health tips of the week?
Yeah, but before I just wanted to touch on something you just said real quick, because I mean, we're not asking nobody to pay us to advertise.
And we're not getting paid to advertise you all either.
I'm like, folks talking about they need a blessing, and they want stuff going on in the pandemic, and they need to get I'm giving you an opportunity. We're giving you an opportunity. Do you know that Heritage Sports Radio Network's listening audience is over 500,000.
And it's on Sirius XM. So I mean, hey, why
would you not reach out and be like, yo, Dr. Pitts, Carla, Ronnie, can y'all shout us out? We're willing to, because you know what happens, right? It's gonna get to a time where we're like, you do know we charge for that,
right?
I was like, there's gonna be a day, and that day is coming soon. All right, there will be a day when hey, look, hey, can you shout my business out? You have to run me that bag real quick. I got you though, but here's
that good advertising package for you. You look now. You can't say that you weren't provided an opportunity to grassroots. This is grassroots.
Exactly.
You know what? It's cool. It's cool. You can't say that you didn't have an opportunity, because we gave you the opportunity and you didn't do it. So it is all good in the neighborhood. So anyway. Yes. Ronnie, you sure you want me to go first? You told me.
You know what? Matter of fact, that is right. Because my tip this week really isn't that long. So you know what? I'm going to go first, because I will not follow up your performance again. Not after last week. So, all right. So real quick. So my mental health tip of the week is, and I'm not sure if we've necessarily touched on this, but I just want to touch on it real quick, is boundaries. Ooh. So, what are boundaries? So in a nutshell, boundaries are when you allow or not allowing certain treatment or things to be said around you or done around you, or to be in certain, spaces. And the reason I want to talk about boundaries is, and I don't know if you all too saw the video from, I think it was Thursday, or it might've been, Thursday, when Michigan State was playing, and one of the players, clearly there was miscommunication on the court. And Tom Izzo had charged after the player, got in his face. The player tried to swipe, Coach Izzo's hand away, and then took off. Coach Izzo ran behind the player, was still yelling. It seemed to be yelling and cursing at the player. And the player stopped and turned around and gave Coach Izzo a look like, hey, look, I know I'm a player, but you ain't going to keep talking to me or pulling on me like this. So, and after the game, Michigan State ended up losing the game. But after the game, Coach Izzo was just like, hey, if that's what y'all really worried about after we just lost in overtime, then I don't know what y'all want me to talk about. And a lot of former players came to Coach Izzo's defense, especially one being Draymond Green of the Golden State Warriors, where he was like, look, that's just Coach Izzo being Coach Izzo. He gets in your face. He's tough and stuff like that. But just the image and the portrayal of, a white man literally tugging on a black player's arm, pulling him, yanking at him, yelling in his face on national TV. And, we all know as coaches, some coaches get very passionate about, the game and stuff like that. I played for a bunch of passionate coaches. I've had coaches call me everything but a blessed child of God in the moment, been there, done that, but not on a national stage and not in front of the public eye. So that's one thing that coaches, clearly a boundary violation. These are still 18 and 19-year-old young men. So treat them like young men. I would be hard pressed to find, too many people who would just allow anybody to just yell in their face, tell them, just go off on them and not have any type of repercussions. But what we have here, we have this dynamic of coach versus player where the player oftentimes feels powerless or like, well, what I'm supposed to say to the coach if he's yelling at me? I mean, what you want me to do? And I think there's a fine line. There's a fine boundary between being passionate and crossing that boundary, especially in today's time and age. We think of coaches like, Bobby Knight, where, he's throwing a chair across the basketball court and things like that. Just very passionate. We got coaches, like Nick Saban, who gets in players' faces and things like that, but never physical with them. So understanding, coaches understanding that boundary of how to coach your players. And we've talked about that on the show before where, not every player responds to being yelled at or demeaned or belittled when they make a mistake. Understanding how you as a coach can get through to your players, even in a time of, frustration, being angry or just, what some coaches call being very passionate about how they get their message across to the players. There's a fine line and a fine boundary. We have to show our players respect, just like the coach wants respect in return. So understanding that boundary and just also, not only boundaries for student athletes and coaches, but boundaries in life, being comfortable with telling people no. Oftentimes when you tell somebody no, it's not a sign of disrespect to them. It's a sign of showing your self-respect, not putting yourself in a position where you feel like you're forced to go to an event or you're forced to go to a social outing or you're forced to go over to family members' houses just because, well, that's what you're supposed to do. Well, being able to say no and lay that boundary where if I don't feel comfortable going here, if I don't feel comfortable being around that person, I would rather excuse myself from that situation so I don't say anything or I don't give off an energy that's going to, infect everybody else. Even in relationships, especially in relationships, having those boundaries clearly established, whether it's, a sexual relationship or a platonic relationship, just having those boundaries put in place to look, this is what I'm going to allow. Anything beyond this, I got to go. You're not going to respect my boundaries. I'm out of here. So, and there's countless other, things when it comes to boundaries, even for mental health providers, setting boundaries with your clients and stuff like that. And Dr. Pitts, I'm pretty sure that's probably one of the first things you do in your sessions is, establishing boundaries and also talking to the client about, hey, what are some things that work with you with other mental health providers? What didn't work? What are some of your boundaries? So I don't cross your boundaries or trigger you in a way that you're not ready to, that you're not ready for and things like that. So everybody has boundaries, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with being able to express your boundaries for respect out of yourself and for respect for the other person. Because like I said, you wouldn't want to go around somebody with a poor attitude or poor demeanor because you feel like you're sacrificing your boundaries for them. That's not going to lead to anything healthy. So if you have boundaries or you want to be able to express your boundaries in life, and you're having a hard time doing that, definitely seek out, some professional help, whether it's a therapist, a mental health provider, somebody who can help you establish those boundaries, whether it's with a coach, a parent, another adult figure in the community, a relationship or anything like that. Boundaries are important, and boundaries are there for a reason to protect you and those around you. So that's my mental health tip of the week. All right, Dr. Pitts, you can top that right there. I know you got that. I know you got it.
So before I give mine, so based on what you said, yes, boundaries are critical. And I actually establish boundaries and behavior expectations during intake, because what happens in this line of work, as you already know, Ronnie, is that people come in and, depending upon what their diagnosis is, they're already suffering with all kinds of boundary violations as it is. And I'll tell you, one of the biggest ones that I experience, which might seem insignificant to some, but I think it'll make sense to both of you, is people want to come out the gate calling me Lauren. No, we're not friends. We're not friends. We're not cool.
Mm.
I'm Dr. Pitts, or you can call me Dr. Lauren, or you can call me Dr. L. But what you can't call me is Lauren, because that blurs the boundary coming out the gate. And, folk are all adamant, hey, Lauren, do I know you? I thought we just met. So I have to establish that boundary straight out the gate, because if not, what ends up happening is people will push the limit. People will they'll try you, and they talk to you in any old type of way, and and then when you get into certain mental health disorders, I find it very interesting, particularly when I have people that have X, Y, and Z illnesses, but they're alphas, because y'all know I'm an alpha. So I let folk know, yeah, so you came to me. And where I do believe that you are the master of your own life, and you got this. Clearly, there's something about the formal education, training, and expertise that you found that could be beneficial to you, or else you wouldn't be here. So we probably need to respect that, because even in my alphaness, I'm not going to say or do anything that's going to, disrespect, violate, or whatever case may be. So I say all that to say, you can't talk to me in any old type of way, because I'll forget. Okay, I tell people I'm a woman first. I'm a woman first with a trauma history of my own, and right now you're triggering me.
So, and by doing that, and to your point, by establishing those boundaries early, it avoids you setting reactionary boundaries.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes that might even turn a client off, or it might turn anybody off if you wait till maybe 4 or 5 meetings in and they say, oh, hey, Lauren, well, time out, I'm Dr. Pitts. Well, oh, excuse me, I must have touched the button. And now they're turned off from even wanting to divulge with you and things like that. It leads down a slippery slope. So definitely, yeah, you're right. Establishing those boundaries early.
Literally, day one, this is what it is. This is what it's going to be. And then the other thing where boundaries are concerned is that I disclose to clients literally during intake that I do have a very strong personality, and I am a solution-focused therapist. So do I have to explore family of origin issues and the traumatic experiences and all of that? I absolutely positively do. I have to be aware of that information in order to be able to develop a solution or solutions for you, or for us to co-create those solutions, but we're not going to dwell there. And as you folk, depending on the diagnoses, are going to try to tell you what to do. And I have no problem saying, so if you have all of the answers, why did you come to me? Why are we here? Exactly. So that's it. That's what I have on boundaries. What I want to touch on real quick, I'm just giving one, and it speaks to what we were talking about in the beginning. I find in this work that more times than not, we have people that come to us because of individual, relational, whether it's vocational stress or mental ill, whatever it is that's plaguing them. And this is something I know you're passionate about, Carla. They're plagued by the critical voices in their head. Yeah. They're plagued by them. They cannot comprehend that the battlefield is in their mind. And even though for some, because let's face it, everybody that comes to us doesn't have a formal mental health diagnosis yet. And what I tell people is that you can put protective factors in place to keep you from getting over into a formal diagnosis, but you're not going to be able to do that unless you're willing to take the appropriate steps to control the critical voices in your head. You can counteract these messages by starting a positivity or a gratitude journal, and do that every single solitary day. Write a minimum of 5 positive things about yourself every day, or a minimum of 5 things that you're grateful for every day. And I said, when I think about, for example, Ronnie, my anxiety clients, right? Folk they get mad. They get mad when you encourage them to be deliberate and intentional in bombarding their mind with positivity. I said, you didn't get like this overnight. You're outside of the technical stuff, right? We know that there's a DSM and the diagnoses and how we assess all of these illnesses and what have you. But let's put the hay down where the goats can get it. One of the issues when it comes to mental illness is you are focusing obsessively on negative thoughts, whether it's the trauma that happened to you, the trauma that you're anticipating that's going to happen to you, what's wrong with your spouse, what's wrong with your kids, what's wrong with you, what's wrong with the world. You're bombarding your mind with all of this negativity, which does what? It trains your mind to be negative. And when your mind is negative, everything else in your life by default follows. That's just the forces of the universe that we live in. Yeah. So I tell clients, you have got to be responsible and accountable for what you allow into your mind. Something as simple as putting a positive affirmation magnet on your refrigerator, putting a positive affirmation sticky on your bathroom mirror or your bedroom mirror. You have the ability to retrain your mind. You have the ability to do it. Whatever your diagnosis is, you have the ability to retrain your mind because it didn't get sick overnight. We know that there's a small percentage of people that come out the womb and you're like, yeah. I'm wrong. I'm wrong. But that's not the norm. That's the exception to the rule. That is not the norm. Everybody else came out the womb with a decent amount of sense, and life happening and parenting and everything else has conditioned the mind to be defeated. And I have found, Ronnie, folk get real mad with me. They get real mad.
Well, that's because usually when you put the focus and the onus on them, they no longer have a crutch or point to someone for their own troubles.
Yep.
So it's like, how dare you say it's my fault that I'm the problem. I'm not the problem.
I've even clarified for folks, this is not victim blaming or shaming. This is what Dr. Pitts calls accountability.
Right.
If you can spend 15, 20 minutes, like if I, depending on the nature of the diagnosis, right? There have been times I've done it just to illustrate a point. I'll let my client talk a hole in my head for a good 10, 15 minutes. And then I'll say, you've spent 15 minutes telling me every single solitary thing that's wrong in every area of your life. Can you tell me one thing that's right? Because where I sit, I'm like, dang, ain't nobody planning your funeral today. You sitting here talking to me. You just talked about how much you love your children, and your children not they not dead, in jail, crazy, strung out on drugs, alcohol. Your kids still talk to you. You know how many clients I got whose kids don't even like them and won't look at them? But you just gave me a whole, so what do we do with that miracle question, Ronnie? We wave that miracle question wand and say, what's the exception? That's solution-focused therapy. What's the exception? You gave me all of this stuff that's wrong. What's the exception? Don't use always, every, and never. What's the exception? He get on my nerves. He always leave the seat up. Dr. Pitts, you just don't know. I'm so
Ronnie.
I'm telling you. It could be once a month. 28 days in a row he put the seat down, but that one day he put up, you always leave the seat up. What am I supposed to do with that? That overgeneralization of people's problems and stuff like that, pointing at everybody else except for them, is impossible to avoid accountability as an adult. Eventually, you will run into somebody that will hold you accountable. Otherwise, you would just be considered a recluse because you're just avoiding all accountability and just listening to yourself. And we know just listening to yourself is not always a great thing. You can trust your gut in certain in some situations, but not always.
Right.
Well, it depends, especially if you're always talking. If you're talking negative to yourself, you don't believe yourself, because that's
Absolutely.
not your God voice is always talking positive and love. If it's not about love, peace, it's not your God voice.
Yeah, and we have to remember that, at the end of the day, it's mental health. When we talk about physical health, what do? We work out, we train our muscles, we exercise and things like that. Your brain is a muscle. You have to exercise your brain. And sometimes even people who exercise, like, somebody like myself who is, considered obese, a lot of obese people, it's not like they don't know they need to work out. It's just the fear of starting and staying consistent with it. Same thing with mental health, that fear of starting, that fear of thinking good things, that fear of having positive thoughts. Well, just do it. Do a little bit, like Dr. Pitt said, do a little bit each day. That adds up. That's training your muscle in your brain right there. It takes time. You're not just going, like she said, you didn't get that way overnight. You're not going to find a solution overnight either. But if you stick to that solution and remain consistent, it could very well be a very productive solution for you. But it's choose your hard. Which one do you want to continue the hard path you're going down now, or do you want to continue the hard path that actually has a reasonable benefit and reward for you?
It's mental rehab, right? Anytime you go to physical therapy because of a broken bone or sprain or whatever the case may be, initially it's uncomfortable and painful. But as that, whatever it is that was damaged, gets stronger, you get stronger. I said to you all last week that there was an activity that I wanted to do, and I'm gonna tell you what it is, but I'm just gonna periodically, when I'm jumping in to add to the conversation, I'm gonna do it, because I think that it's really fitting for today. There is an identity activity that I do with my students and my clients that really requires folks to get in touch with their authentic self, because we know a lot of people have a hard time doing that, right? And people, as we were talking before the show, people validate themselves by being a sports fan or being a scholar athlete or being a professional athlete. Like it's everything to them. So throughout the show, I'm going to challenge our viewing and listening audience to say to yourself, who am I? I want you to keep asking yourself that until you get past the superficial version of yourself. Keep asking yourself that until you start to feel the emotion coming up as you get more and more and more honest with who you are. Who am I? The second question I want you to ask yourself is, who do others say I am? Who do others say I am? And I want you, what I tell my clients to do and my students, I have them ask themselves that 6 times, each question 6 times. And you're not allowed to duplicate your answer. And watch how hard it is for just it's hard. It is hard to be that vulnerable and transparent with yourself. But my encouragement to our viewing and listening audiences is that when you make the conscious decision to get in touch with your authentic self, then some of these questions that we pose to you week after week, and some of these things that we share with you to provoke your thoughts, you'll be able to make well-informed decisions concerning them, because you won't be making decisions based on limited or wrong information. You'll be making decisions based on who you are authentically at your core. The third question that I want everybody to ask themselves is, and this is the one that usually has my clients and my students toe up. Who do I pretend to be? Who do I pretend to be? 3 questions. Who am I? Who do others say I am? And who do I pretend to be? All right, Ronnie, let's go. All right, Carla.
All right. So I think, since it's a hot topic and, it's definitely been the forefront of this week's conversations regarding to the NCAA, before we get into, athleticism or slavery, I think we should definitely address, what's been going on with the March Madness tournament this week, especially on the women's side. So I want to read this letter that the head coach of South Carolina University's women's basketball team, Coach Dawn Staley, wrote. She just released it this morning. So it says, I cannot be quiet. In a season that has been focused on justice and equality, it's disheartening that we are addressing the glaring deficiencies and inequalities in the women's and men's NCAA tournament experiences for the student athletes. But here we are. First, I believe that Lynn Holzman and her team have done a tremendous job with the resources they were given. It is not lost that a great deal of preparation and planning went into getting 64 teams to San Antonio. We all need to acknowledge and thank them for their efforts. The issue here looms larger. Let's start with the NCAA at March Madness official verified Twitter account. The tagline leaves no room for the misinterpretation. The official NCAA March Madness destination for all things Division I NCAA men's basketball. Those words mean one thing. March Madness is only about men's basketball. How do we explain that to our players? How can an organization that claims to care about all member institutions' student athlete experiences have a copyrighted term that only represents one gender? Next to inequalities that are circulating on social media, there is no answer that the NCAA executive leadership led by Mark Emmert can give to explain the disparities. Mark Emmert and his team point blank chose to create them. The real issue is not the weights or the swag bags. It's that they did not think or do not think that the women's players deserve the same amenities of the men. What we know is the NCAA's season-long messaging about togetherness and equality was about convenience and a soundbite for the moment created after the murder of George Floyd. We cannot, as leaders of young women, allow Mark Emmert and his team to use us and our student athletes at their convenience. Every team here in San Antonio has earned and deserves at a minimum the same level of respect as the men. All the teams here dealt with the same issues as the men's teams did this season, yet their reward is different. It is sad but not unusual that the headlines for the women's tournament have turned to disparities and nightly meetings about how to try to fix what should not need to be fixed. We need Mark Emmert and his team to own this mistake and address these issues and the overarching issues that exist in our sport. Women's basketball is a popular sport whose stock and presence continues to rise on a global level. It is sad that the NCAA is not willing to recognize and invest in our growth despite its claims of togetherness and equality. We all came to San Antonio with one goal. It's time for us to turn our attention to preparing our teams for that. But it's also time for the NCAA leadership to reevaluate this value they place on women. Wow.
That was deep.
Yeah. And we have these conversations, us three, every so often about, the disparities between the men's sport and the women's sport. But I would even argue that at least at the collegiate level, I would argue that women's college basketball, especially during tournament time, don't get me wrong, it may not be watched as much as the men's March Madness, but don't get me wrong, people are tuning into women's college basketball.
Yeah.
They are tuning in, because when I think of women's college basketball, I think everybody will probably say the first team they think of is, of course, UConn. They think of Gino Auriemma and things like that, and the success he's had, with women's basketball. However, when you start to have, especially prominent coaches like Dawn Staley, who is a Black, the African-American woman who has a very successful team, just won the national championship, I think maybe 2 or 3 years ago with South Carolina. When you are treating as a whole institution, you're treating these women just blatantly unfairly. And it's not like they're asking for 5-star meals and, to stay at the Ritz-Carlton down in San Antonio. I don't even know if they have a Ritz-Carlton down there.
Well, the guys didn't even get that.
Yeah, both are complaining, but to your point, Ronnie, I think there's a different conversation when you're talking about NBA versus the WNBA, and then the NCAA women's versus the NCAA men's
absolutely
players. So, in terms of player care and swag bags and all that, I think that there's no reason why it should be different. There's no reason why it should be a big disparity there. Absolutely no.
And I think when you see, like, I was reading where, Kobe Bryant's wife, she had even reached out to the NCAA about donating, shoes to the teams who are outfitted with Nike, donating free shoes, free Kobe Bryant shoes to those teams. Right. And NCAA basically said, nah, we good. We're not going to do that. And it's just like, it ain't like that's coming out your pocket, but we see this thing, when we talk about the NCAA and the amateur rule, and that's going to, kind of lead into our, our next segment. When we talk about this amateur rule, where it's like, people from the outside the institution or outside the NCAA are not allowed to give these players, what they consider monetary benefits or anything like that, because it's deemed a violation. But I just don't like how, I don't know how much this tournament is going to generate as far as revenue wise. I highly doubt it generates what it has in the past, but it's going to generate a lot of money because that TV deal still came through.
Yeah.
So they're still getting money from the TV deals. However, it just saddens me that, a lot of people live, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of people live for this tournament. This is the most watched tournament in the world, and it's not even close.
Yeah.
So for the NCAA to, literally just drop the ball for both men and women,
the NCAA is a dying organization. It's
especially for basketball. Absolutely.
Football also, because the Power 5 schools can really, the NCAA needs the Power 5. The Power 5s don't need the NCAA.
Wow.
So
okay. I like that.
Yeah. So the NCAA has become this big behemoth bureaucracy that's no longer needed. Especially with the new, that's why they came up with the new rule change that players can are allowed to
likeness.
Exactly. So why do you need the NCAA really? What's the purpose, right?
Yeah. So for our viewers out there who might not be, so Dr. Pitts, do you have any thoughts or opinions about what's going on with the men's and women's tournament?
I think that it's just more of the same of the culture in this country when it comes to injustice and inequality. I think about it within the context of all white, all male, all, power, right? Who are the executive leaders? Who are the shot callers? Who are the true ballers in these decisions that are being made? And where's the accountability? It goes back to what we've said week after week after week. We really do have power, right? Yeah. Carla, you just made a very valid point. We don't need them. They need us.
Yeah, right.
So why are we not exercising that power to get what's really due and to really, 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 to really activate, for lack of a better word, the true power and the authority that we have to evoke change?
Well, and until all right, so we're talking about the elite athletes. Now, the elite athletes have places to go. They could go to Europe, or Adam Silver talked about the league creating a league for younger players. So that avenue is definitely there. So really, we're talking about the athletic directors at the Big Five really are the controllers of the NCAA. So,
absolutely.
So it's going to take the institutions to either gain control in the NCAA. It's a money-making organization, along with the Big Five, the Power Fives. So, maybe the smaller schools just opting out of the NCAA control. There's nothing wrong with a conferences saying we're not going to compete in the NCAA. We'll just create our own league and we'll create our own schedule. And hey, if there's other conferences that want to come with us, we'll have our own national championship. No, it won't be watched, but hey, they're not getting any money. Division III, Division II, not really getting that much money anyway. So what's the point? So I think the NCAA is in a real precarious type situation. They've had too much power, and it's kind of silly. Because when I was playing, a ride from Coach Sweat from practice to the cafeteria, actually, that was an NCAA violation.
It's illegal. Yeah. Wow. Hell, we had coaches my freshman and sophomore year because we had players who lived off campus, because, where our campus is located, we have the city of Petersburg that's right next door, and, the apartment buildings, spread out throughout Petersburg. But we have players who live 15, 20 minutes away from campus but didn't have cars. And so, it was either up to us as those who had cars, or the coach would have to go get them. But to your point, Ms. Carla, that's illegal by NCAA rules. That,
Right.
a coach can't go get a player, somebody who's on their roster in need of practice or study hall, or just to get to class, just to maintain their eligibility.
Right.
That's illegal. And so I think this is a great point to transition into our main topic of, athleticism, versus slavery. So I want to kind of, set the picture, give a little context and history, as to why this is such a big issue. So, and what we're necessarily talking about here is specifically, Division I, Power 5 conferences, football and basketball, because, the ACC, Big 10, Big 12, Pac-12, and SEC. Those are the big 5 money-making conferences in the NCAA for men's and women's basketball. Well, I'm sorry, not men's and women's, but men's football and basketball. So for those who have never, those who weren't a student athlete in college or anything like that, I just want to give you an idea of the basic week for a student athlete for football and basketball. But I'm just going to talk on the football end. So for a normal Monday through Sunday football schedule for a student athlete, the NCAA grants 20 hours of what they consider practice time. So that's on the field, actual practice. So it breaks up to about 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. That doesn't include study hall. That doesn't include weightlifting. That doesn't include film study. That doesn't include engagement that the university has scheduled for y'all. That doesn't include community service engagements. So in just a standard week, a football student athlete, and this is for all 3 levels, a football student athlete will probably donate at least 40 hours of their time to football each week, on top of being a student athlete, on top of having a full academic caseload, which for most universities to be considered full-time is 12 credit hours a semester. So that's 4 classes. So on top of those 4 classes that you have to maintain a certain GPA for, you also have to commit 40 hours a week to your respective sport, specifically football. So in 2015, the Division I Power 5 conferences that I mentioned came up with this new standard where they're going to give a cost of living stipend in the student athlete scholarship. Now, this only goes for those who are on full academic scholarships, not partial scholarship, now walk on. Just those who are just full athletic scholarships. So this stipend ranged anywhere from $2,500 to $5,000 a semester for that student athlete. So I found a school who said that, their way of doing it was spectacular. This school happened to be University of Kansas. So University of Kansas athletic director said that on average for their full athletic scholarship student athletes on campus, they received on average of $3,644 a semester for their stipend. So I broke that down. Over 4 months, you're looking at about $911. The average rent in Kansas, the state of Kansas, the average rent in the state of Kansas is $1,097. So if you're a student athlete who decides to move off of campus, get your own place, but you get your stipend, 9 times out of 10, you're probably not going to be able to afford rent. And that doesn't even include utilities, groceries, food, car maintenance, things like that. But they want you to be at practice at 5 a.m. to lift them weights, and then be at class at 8 a.m. to be in class all day from 8 to 2. And then from 2 to 6, they want you to be on the practice field. And then from 7 to 9:30, they want you to be in study hall. And then from 9:30 to about 2 in the morning, they want you to finish up that homework you didn't finish in study hall. All for $911 extra a month. So when we talk about, athleticism and slavery, especially in, what we consider the NCAA as being what we consider the modern day slave institution. When I hear that word, me personally, when I hear that word, part of me says like, well, that's just unfair to compare it to slavery, because, at the end of the day, you are getting education. Don't get me wrong. You are getting education. You are getting certain benefits and perks and things like that. However, I would argue that, and like we've seen here, like just for the March Madness, for example, in 2017, they profited $900 million just from March Madness. In that 1 month time, they profited $900 million. And I don't know if you all remember back in 2013, I think it was Shabazz Napier for the UConn men's basketball team after they won the Big East tournament. His most famous interview probably in his lifetime was when he said, well, I got to go back home. I ain't got no food in the house because I don't have enough money to have food in my house. And I mean, the NCAA was like, oh, well, we don't know what he's talking about. He gets a scholarship, he gets a stipend. We don't know why he ain't got no money. But when he showed receipts of how much that stipend was, I think it was only a couple $100s a month. It wasn't even that close to being $900 a month. The NCAA came out and said, well, going forward on this day, we're going to make sure all student athletes Division I are going to have at least some type of food access 24/7 while they're a student at school. Well, why wasn't that something that was already established? So when we talk about, and this is just me personally, I think slavery is like a very, that's an explicit term to compare it to. I was reading an article where it said it's more compared to the Jim Crow era, where, the institutions, like this amateur rule that the NCAA has had for decades, this amateur, like being an amateur in the NCAA where you're not allowed to receive any monetary benefits from outside members of the institution. You're not allowed to hold a job if you're a full athletic scholarship holder. You can't have a YouTube page or, have your own type of business on the side or anything like that. You're just basically paid a tuition to be a student athlete for 4 to 5 years. And if you go pro, great. If you don't go pro, well, I hope you were in class studying because that's all you're going to get from us. And if you broke your body up, got concussions like I did, got knees all broke up and all that good stuff, well, I hope you find a job that has a great insurance policy and life insurance policy because that's all we're going to give you after that.
Yeah.
And so, and that's what we see here. And, even though this year a lot of states are starting to pass this name, image, and likeness rule, let's be real. This only applies to Division I. But, for a lot of the HBCUs and other small schools where, they're Division I AA or even Division II or Division III, none of those benefits are going to be passed down to those schools because they lack the resources and revenue that those big schools attract.
Well,
So
I think, I'm sorry. I was going to say, well, I think when it comes to that part, I think now is where the creativity comes in, right? Is not a passed down thing. It's like Primetime was talking at Jackson State, right? Who's the marketing person at those HBCUs that's going to create that opportunity for the students? Now it's like this is a great opportunity to create what you want this thing to look like, right? Right. So, it's not going to be a pass down thing. How are those HBCUs going to create that infrastructure to help those students? And I say with the following of some HBCU schools, it could be very, very beneficial. But you got to gain your audience, right? And I think slavery is a real hard push. It's a hard word because there were no choices in slavery.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, these kids have all the choices in the world. It's like they have to now figure out what they want, what's important to them. A lot of people want to go to these big Power 5 schools because they want to go, they want the exposure and they want to go to the NCAA tournament.
And I think, and to your point about, and absolutely, slavery, you really had no choice. Like, when we think of the word slave, that means you're literally, your life is indentured servant. You're entitled to somebody else. Like, you're their property. And I mean, and like I said, I hate to use that same comparison. However, when we talk about, well, I'm not going to say however, because I'm still not trying to compare it, but I will say that, to your point about student athletes having choices, and I think we've touched on this in numerous shows as well, this lore and like this prize that's dangled over these kids, especially those Black student athletes who come from these impoverished homes and come from these dysfunctional areas where, this salvation is hung over their head. Like, look, if you want to be the salvation for your family, here's your ticket. And they can, and it's like they control that ticket. But to your point, I think now with social media, now with things changing as far as name, image, and likeness, there are avenues for student athletes to have other options. Right. But like we said last week, I think those options have to start at home. Those have to be preached at home, and it can't wait till this kid is already 18, 19, and they only see that their only salvation to life is going to be this sport. because
just remember now. I mean, I'm sorry for interrupting you,
you're fine.
but I kind of push back on the notion that all the Black kids, or even the majority of Black kids that's going to these schools, are somehow destitute. Not all of them are. There's
Absolutely,
a
yeah.
damn. I just push back when poor gets to be synonymous with Black. That's all.
Oh no, and yeah, and I definitely don't want to portray it as being an overgeneralization of that. All Blacks, Black superior top athletes at Division I level are just all poor, because we know that's not the case at all.
Right.
We know that's not the case. However, that is a tactic that is used on, they do target, they do target that crowd, and often, and to your point, I think the reason that a lot of them don't make it to that level is because they come from areas where they have poor support systems, and the grades are just not a lot. They just can't make it.
Right.
There's a lot of student athletes who come from those areas who get to that level, but because they don't have that structure or that support system around them, and they've always just had poor grades and don't see school as an option, or the education system as an option to be a salvation, they just fall to the wayside and they drop out of school, or they trickle down to Division II and Division III at that level, even junior college. Like, Jared has shared with us, even though poor grades wasn't his reason for going to junior college, being trickled down to junior college, I think that, that still is a bait tactic that they do use. But no, I definitely don't want to overgeneralize it that, all of them are like that. I don't want to say that at all. But go ahead.
I think, and maybe this is just me being, I don't even know the word I want to use. I mean, clearly we do know that the socioeconomic status of all student athletes of color, they're not coming from poverty. My concern isn't an overgeneralization. My concern is that any student athlete of color coming from an impoverished situation, because when we talk about the systemic problem, right? And we've talked time and time again on the show about, the lack of value that's placed on education and the lack of resources in these public school systems that are in these impoverished areas. I think that it's a setup. It's like one person enslaved is one person too many. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I don't, one woman being treated unjustly is one woman too many. So that's my concern, is that there are too many. They're just, if I had to guess, and of course I have no idea, but if there were a way to find those statistics, I would be curious to know, at all levels, D1, D2, and D3, of the Black student athletes that are coming into the athletic arena at the collegiate level, if you look, if you could pull their FAFSA and see what their estimated family contribution is, how many of those students come into college play genuinely and sincerely not needing scholarship monies in comparison to those who do. So I think it's bigger than that. I think that it's a mushroom that's gotten out of control. And because it's gotten out of control for those athletes that are impoverished, I feel like by design, it was put in place for leverage. Let's face it, you can entice. Poverty hurts, lack hurts. Not being able to, live a decent quality of life is a painful existence. And what does that look like? I mean, the reality of it is, there are kids out there that feel like the only way they would get to college would be through their athletic ability. Yeah, they might have sugar plums dancing in their head of going to the league, but they want to go to college. And what do we know about the U.S. Department of Education? You're more than likely, your financial aid award package, unless you're one of those elite persons that gets a full ride, your financial aid award package is going to include a student loan. Well, if you don't have anybody credit worthy in your system to be able to sign for you to get the portion of the loan that's not guaranteed by the Department of Education, you end up oftentimes, in some cases, at the community college, at junior college. Or what do? You know what? I'm going to play ball. I'm going to play football. I'm going to play basketball. I'm going to play baseball. I'm going to do whatever I need to do to get some of this athletic money, because that's the only way I'm going to get a college education. And I think what I'm saying, the long-winded version of what I'm saying, is that the whole system is flawed. And because the whole system is flawed, unfortunately, just like in any situation, those persons that are most vulnerable are the ones that suffer the most because of the flawed system.
Well, I think just like a student, if they were talented in music, they would get a scholarship also. I think scholarships offer opportunity. Doesn't mean you have to go to a bigger school.
Right.
Matter of fact, I think the situation is some of those athletes are mix match. I can't say that. And they go to large schools where, you're talking about the Power 5 schools that are like cities within themselves versus smaller schools that, you're in a school, you it's easier to meet friends, and smaller classrooms. So I think what we're talking, I don't think it's a situation where someone's taking advantage of you. I think it's the situation where the kids is not really looking at what's the best fit for them. And in terms of the systemic schools, I don't know if you saw the video that I sent you about from Thomas Sowell. He is a Black economist, and one of the things he said was, he grew up in Harlem, and he said he didn't remember just gunshots being the norm where he grew up. And there is a systemic problem with our culture.
Absolutely. Good Lord.
Where we don't value, we call the kid who's interested in school a geek, or some derogatory term. So he wants to keep it real.
Yeah, and I
Isn't
think
that learned?
What's that?
Isn't that learned?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think, to both of y'all's points, and I just wanted to share this point, why I wouldn't necessarily consider it, the NCAA student athletes being compared to slaves, but more of like living through kind of like a Jim Crow era, in a sense, where it's like, you're free in a sense, but your access to resources and your access to economic opportunities that Ms. Carla speaks to going through the NCAA system is restricted and limited. Like, let's look at college basketball for a system. Before, I think it was 2005 was the year they instituted. It was either 2004, 2005, when they said, all right, for basketball, you got to either at least be 19 or you have to be out of high school for a year. That was after, because everybody thinks it was after LeBron James came in, but it was actually after Dwight Howard, because Dwight Howard also went from high school straight to the NBA. And I believe he came out a year after LeBron, which was in 2004. So that year after he came out was when, they said, hey, look, we're losing all this top talent to the NBA straight out of high school. We need to filter this talent into the NCAA, which you saw that partnership between the NCAA and NBA. The NCAA is like, look, we're grooming this talent for you. We're getting them ready to come to the NBA, but we can't do our job if we're not getting the top talent, because top talent brings in top viewers. Top viewers bring in top dollars. So they changed that. Now with football, and I've kind of gone back and forth with football internally, because I mean, unless you just just a freak of nature coming out of high school as a football player, maybe a lineman, like maybe 6'6", 6'7". I mean, just like
270.
When you see him step off the bus, you just like, yo, where's his birth certificate? Like, ain't no way in the world this kid is a high school player. Unless they look like that and they just like, they just stick out.
Yeah.
I feel like for a football player going to college to play football now, do I think the 3-year rule is fair? That can be debated, but I will say that by playing football, like, they equivalent just offensive linemen and defensive linemen hitting each other to that of a small car accident every single play. Yeah. And we're only less than a foot away from each other, but that contact that we generate in that foot of separation is equivalent to a mini car accident. And you do that 60 to 65 times a game over the course of 3 to 4 months. So I do think for the body, developmentally wise, for football players, I do see why they make you play college football for a couple of years. However, do I feel like you should be tied to that? No. I was reading this article where they propose where you strip away the stipulations of how long somebody should play NCAA sport, kind of like how baseball does it. I don't know if too many people are familiar with how baseball does it, but as a baseball player, you can be drafted out of high school, but they'll tell you like, hey, we like you, we want to draft you, we're going to draft you. However, you either can go to the farm system that the MLB has, or you can go to college. And if we feel like you're good enough, we'll call you up. They don't lose their amateurism status. Now they can't and I don't know the specific, but I think as a baseball player in college, you can't get paid even though you're drafted. That money has to be put off to the side, because the day you accept that payment, you lose your amateurism status. Okay. So, but
what about a football player that plays professional baseball? Is that the same situation? Because that happens.
So for example, Kyler Murray, Kyler Murray, who was the quarterback for Arizona Cardinals, that's a great example. So, the year he was deemed the starter of Oklahoma Sooners, he had an agreement because he was drafted number 10 overall by the Oakland A's going into that season for football. So he was drafted number 10 by the Oakland A's, and they had an agreement. The Oakland A's said, look, we'll allow you to play this season. We'll allow you to play this one football season. Soon as this football season's over, you coming with us. We're sending you to our minor league team. You're going to play baseball. He was cool with it. He actually ended up going to win the Heisman that year. And he changed his mind. He said, look, I appreciate y'all drafting me number 10 overall, but I'm going to go try football real quick. He ended up getting drafted by the Arizona Cardinals, and so far so good. But to your point, even though he got drafted number 10 overall, he didn't the contract, he didn't sign the contract. It was like agreed to the contract, but he didn't sign it, because if he would have signed it, I'm pretty sure he had a signing bonus, and that would have made him eligible for football. So it's kind of like like a verbal agreement for college recruiting. Like, I'm gonna verbally agree to come here, but I'm not signing my name on the national letter of intent until I decide, okay, this is where I'm coming. So I think in that aspect, stripping away that restriction for NCAA student athletes of football and basketball, I think that can be a step in the right direction. Because like we said, if this kid is banking it all on this sport, if this kid has made the decision that I'm going to bank my livelihood on playing this sport, why should I be, especially for basketball? And I think for basketball, this is an even bigger conversation, because I think for basketball, if you're talented, you can play at the NBA level. It might take you a couple of years to adjust, but if you're talented and that good, then and when we talk about this, we're only speaking about maybe 1 to 2 players every other year who will qualify for this. It's not like this is an every year thing where now, don't get me wrong, the talent level and the collection of talent is getting better across the board for all sports. Don't get me wrong, because we're more focused on diet, nutrition, training, things like that at the high school level. So the collection of talent is getting better. But when we're talking about making this leap from high school to pros, or just 1 year of college football, college basketball to pros, we're only talking about a very select handful of people. However, that very select few handful of people always tend to be people of color. Now in football, quarterbacks are a little bit differently, because quarterbacks are mainly a white played position, even though there are plenty of black quarterbacks out there, especially in the league nowadays, who wholeheartedly can play quarterback and don't have to justify it. But I think when we talk about this situation, we're talking about a handful of student athletes who just happen to be people of color, who are told like, hey, look, you have an immense talent, great talent, but we're going to make our money off you first before you go make money. And to your point, it's a risk. At the end of the day, don't get me wrong, playing a sport, it's a choice, but it's also a privilege at that level in a sense, because not everybody makes it there. And not to discredit anybody's hard work, but everybody had to work hard to get to that level. Yeah. But for the NCAA as an institution to kind of, almost in a sense, manipulate these 18 and 19-year-old kids to say, look, you're going to put your body on the line for this scholarship that literally, I mean, at the end of the day, it covers the bare minimum. It covers tuition.
It's the minimum wage of sports.
I don't think it started out that way. I think that the Black athlete elevated the sport so much that a smart person knew that hey, those players are bringing eyes and butts to our games, right? And it's all about the freaking eyes and butts.
Oh, to your point, I have that person's name.
There's a name.
It's crazy because it's crazy. Oh man, I was just reading an article. Keep talking, Carla. I didn't mean to cut you off. I'm gonna find that person's name. That's fine.
Yeah. So I don't think it's intentional by saying we're gonna use these student athletes. It's like we're gonna use the situation. We're gonna use the situation because marketers, people want to get to this audience, and we have this audience now.
An optimistic approach to revenue generation,
right? So I mean, because they got Title IX, they got to pay for Title IX because I was reading only softball is becoming a revenue generating sport, and women's basketball is not a revenue generating sport. It can be,
but it's just not.
It's just not. But softball is. So you got to you got to find a way to pay for all those non-rev sports. So I think that's what happened.
And I think I can't find the person. I don't know which article it was, but basically the person who kind of constructed the NCAA for sports, like how they would monetize, how they would regulate sports and stuff. Mm-hmm. To your point, Carla, his motivation for it wasn't because he saw, that Black student athletes were definitely, bringing eyes and viewers and stuff that to the sport. But what he said was he recognized that at this age, we could monetize these student athletes and make a system out of it. But even after he retired and in the late 90s, they re-interviewed him and they said, the people who run it now, they have just, gone over and aboard with it, with just how much they get out of these players. And I wanted to bring something to y'all's attention real quick because I didn't even know this. Former coach Rick Pitino for Louisville's men's basketball team, famous coach, all that, won the national championship in 2013 and all that. From what I've heard, very good man, very great coach. However, Louisville had a sponsorship deal with Adidas when he was there. Mm-hmm. Did you all know that he got 98% of that deal?
Yeah, that's the way it works. I worked for a Division I. I mean, when I was at University of Maine, Joanne P. Was sponsored by Nike. I don't know what percentage was her salary, but she was paid by that's the freaking. I mean, but Rick Pitino, he was a superstar though.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, but
so he was paid for that.
But even then, like, I would just say, well, I was like, well, damn, 98%. That's for that, and that's for the sponsorship contract for him every year. He gets 98% of that deal, and I was just like,
well,
he's a great coach, but at the end, and that's I think that's kind of like where we're gonna see how that changes this year.
Yeah,
when the name, image, and likeness becomes a thing, because like we said, I think because the NCAA has had a stranglehold on how they regulate student athletes getting paid all these decades, and now they're starting to lose that grip because there are other opportunities outside of that. I think I think we're going to see how it goes for basketball. I think football, with name, image, and likeness, it's going to be interesting to see how they capitalize on that, because I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for football than it is for basketball. Because let's be real, football players are famous, but they're football famous, if that makes sense, because they got a helmet on. Right. Yeah, they got a helmet on. They got all this gear on. So the only time you necessarily really see their face is when they do an interview. Whereas basketball players, you see their face all the time. It's only but so many of them, so they have a chance to stand bigger. So I think for basketball players, this name, image, and likeness bill is going to be a game changer for them. I think for football, being able to capitalize that, and to your point, Ms. Carla, for the smaller divisions to be able to capitalize on that is going to be interesting to see. But
think about this. Think about this, right? You have a whole team of Nike, right? Say you have a star player and he signs Adidas, because Adidas coming up, especially with they have a aligned with the Beehive, Beyonce.
Oh yeah,
So,
yeah.
all right, so you have this one star player signed with Adidas, and everybody else is Nike. How's that gonna look?
So I give you for the CIAA when I was in undergrad. So I can't remember his first name, but I know his name was Coach Johnson. He was the one of the head coaches for the track team for the U.S. Olympic track team and for the '96 Olympics. He's now the head coach at St. Augustine's College for their track team. So everybody in the CIAA, when I was in undergrad, we had Nike contract for shoes, cleats, and all that good stuff. But our apparel was Russell. But when he was there, he had his track team all Nike everything. And he had to pay a fine for that every semester, which he was cool with. He was like, well, hell, I'm getting paid by the Olympic team. So, I mean, this little fine y'all gonna give me is nothing. But check this out. For the actual student athletes, and I don't know how this is at every conference, but for the CIAA when I was playing, because they told us this every single summer when we reported for camp. For me, I like wearing Nike gloves because they had better padding. You know, I could really mess somebody up with that padding. Not gonna say what I used to do with that glove, but hey,
Yeah, I got you. I had some tricks too.
the Russell glove didn't provide that.
No.
So if you got caught I just use football for example. If you got caught in a football game and the CIAA official came to the game and saw you with Nike gloves on, Nike socks, a Nike headband, or anything, you got fined $150 as a student athlete.
Really?
Not the school, not the AD, not the head coach. The student athlete got fined $150, and you couldn't get back on the field of competition until you paid that fine.
Oh my gosh!
Now I don't know how that works at every other conference, but
it's not
like we're talking about, and a division. And I can tell you this right now, as a Division II scholar athlete, and I had a full ride at Division II for Virginia State. I didn't get a stipend. I didn't get no stipend every month.
You didn't get a Pell. You didn't get a Pell Grant.
No, my family didn't qualify for that one right there.
That was a stipend right there, because I could put together a package.
Rid of that. In Virginia, they had got rid of that for a lot of families. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So now I never got fined for anything, but I had teammates who got fined for getting caught with Nike gloves or the Nike wristbands that they would put on their arms or legs and stuff like that. And they got fined $150. And, they had to, either a teammate had to give it to them or, if their family members had it, they had to pay that for them just so they could be eligible again. And, and that's just at our level. I don't know how that practice works at other conferences. Would I be shocked if that happened? No.
They wouldn't get on the field, period, because the coaches and the equipment managers actually the equipment managers are very important in that respect, because University of Maine, we had an awesome equipment manager, and the kids had everything that they needed, and because of the money, that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah,
right.
And
cash is king.
And to your point, we did have equipment managers, and our coaches used to well, for me, I would just cut the Nike symbol off my glove, so you
exactly. Yeah.
But but it's crazy that for a student athlete, like you said, with the name, image, and likeness thing, if they get a sponsorship deal or something like that outside of the team, it's gonna be interesting to see how that happens. But just on the NCAA standpoint, and just allowing conferences to fine student athletes, because it's well, we can't make money outside of the sport. We can't get money from from people like that. But you can fine us, and if we don't have the money, we lose eligibility.
That may be a CIAA thing.
It could be. It very well could be.
I never heard anything like that. I mean, but I was in the CIAA in the 80s, so things change. We wore comfort.
So I mean, so
I don't think we had a big deal. I don't know how that worked back then.
So, let me ask you a question, Ronnie, real quick.
What's up?
To you both. Because you shared something that my brain just keeps circling back. So let's take the word slavery out of the explanation here. Isn't what you both described still the concept of slavery, though? So you each said something, Ronnie, you said something about performance and when we look at elite athletes and even from an eligibility standpoint, right? So when you think about some of the horror stories that we know about slavery, wasn't there this division between field hands and house negroes, right?
I mean, even just getting them over here, you had to be the bit like, and not to be too vulgar, but you had to have the biggest genital parts as a male. You had to be muscular. You had to be and that's not all the case, but as far as like getting the pick of the litter in a sense, you were the stud.
Right. And then when you look at, again, how we were pitted against each other to create this hierarchy, right? So when I think of, and I'm just asking thought-provoking questions. So when I think about even the respect and the reputation of the divisions, and to Carla's point, these athletes that focus on Division I, these Power 5 schools over the Division II or the Division III schools. Well, wasn't the goal to be a house negro? What, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, and
that's strong. That is so strong, man.
From the concept, what I'm saying is, even when you take slavery out of it, there's still this manipulative concept in there that, though we're not in shackles and chains anymore, some of the same ideologies are formed based on conceptually how this whole thing is being managed. What do we know? And we talked about it on previous shows. HBCUs don't get the same respect that the PWI Division I schools get, a variety of reasons, but
the thing about it, all right. So if you want to, those top tier athletes and all athletes really want to compete at the highest level, and right now that's the highest level. I was thinking about this in terms of HBCUs and PWIs getting the same respect. Why don't we do this? And this is I'm asking this question to provoke, right? What if we get rid of the HBCU conferences? All right, and the Division I schools, like, be like Hampton. Hampton went to the Southern Conference, and other HBCU Division I schools that can compete at the other PWI conferences. All right, so split them up. The schools that can't really compete at the Division I level, split them up, and they go to PWI Division II conference or PWI Division III conference, depending on their level and their vision. Well, now you're not eliminating each other for a championship. All right, now you're in the mix, and now you're competing every game, every day against the same type of school, but they just happen to be PWI. Would that help?
People call their people.
I mean, would that
help? Well. Okay, so Miss Carla, so on paper that doesn't sound like a bad idea, but here's where the trouble will run into. On average, HBCU carry at Division II level. So the allotment, the max allotment of scholarships you're allowed to have at the Division II level is 36, where at Division I level is 85. So right there, from Division I to Division II, there's a significant drop off of over half.
Right.
However, for Division II, and they've had a lot of arguments about this just at the Division II level. They've argued for having where they have a national championship for teams who have the full 35 scholarship athletes on their team compared to the teams who don't even come close. Like in Virginia State, for example, when I was at Virginia State, out of a team of, I think my last year, out of a team of maybe 105 players, there was only, maybe 9 of us who had full rides.
Really?
but the rest of that money was split up amongst those who got. So,
I know
a lot of Division II schools do this is where they'll take that money. So I'm assuming the NCAA says, look, out of their 35 scholarships, it's an average, whatever the cost of tuition is for that school year. So a lot of Division II schools who can't field that many players or give that many people scholarship money because they just don't have enough revenue to support the players who don't get scholarships, they split those scholarships up. So they might give 4 or 5 players a full ride. Right. I was fortunate enough to be one of those 4 or 5 players on our team to get a full ride. Everybody else get 1,000 here, 2,000 here. They might get money to cover books. They might get money to cover, stuff like that. So I think even at that point,
you're bringing back memories out of this. I'm going through shock right now.
I think even with that, if you eliminate the conferences, I think you would still see a large disparity in the overall talent versus talent of the teams because, a lot of the bigger white Division II schools are able to field 35 full ride scholarship athletes for the football team. Whereas, the most prominent, take for instance, Winston-Salem in 2012 made the national championship as a HBCU for Division II. They ended up losing to Valdosta State, which is a PWI, and Valdosta State is a very good school. But that year, Winston-Salem only had, I think, maybe 15 players that were on scholarship, like full ride scholarships. The rest of that money was split up amongst the other players they had. And that year, Winston-Salem had the most Division I transfers on their team for Division II, loaded with Division I talent, but not all of them got money. So I think even when you talk about that, like eliminating the conferences and just having like this big pool of like, you play people in your region and stuff like that, I still think you would see that disparities between the HBCUs and PWIs. Number one, because the lack of funding, which we've talked about before, the lack of alumni support for a lot of these schools, not only at HBCUs, it's PWIs as well, right. But generally PWIs do a better job of being able to recruit alumni to donate funds and stuff like that.
I think we need to learn from that. That's instead of pointing a finger at, hey, you don't need to do as well, but say, hey, how do y'all do it?
Exactly. And Dr. Pitts, when we started this show, every week we used to shout out HBCUs. And when we would shout out the big ones like Howard, FAMU, Hampton, all those schools who have, their alumni track. Those schools should never, ever, ever have to worry about shutting down or being without. Don't get me wrong. Virginia State has a whole bunch of famous alumni. Uncle Phil from Fresh Prince. I can't think of his name. It is named after him. The business school is named after him, but he was one of the first Black billionaires in the country and stuff like that. So, all these HBCUs have alumni who do very well for themselves. But we've talked about this before. We get to that mentality of it's like, well, I made it. I shouldn't have to come back and help you all out because I made it. Y'all didn't take advantage of your opportunity. Not saying that's every alumni, but the message that has always been painted, especially in the Black community when it comes to schools is, why I'm gonna give this school more money when I just gave them all this money? Failing to realize this, the government gave that school that money so you could go here.
Well, or they see, like in the case of Morris Brown, they see massive misappropriation.
Yeah.
So
Virginia State had that happen too. Yeah.
Right.
And,
so
and that goes to hiring your own and hiring friends and family to do the job. That nepotism that we see, within HBCU systems that break down the institution because of that nepotism and that friendship where, you mix friends with business and stuff like that. And like we talked about earlier, not holding other adults accountable for their actions and how they don't realize that your actions solely impact future generations.
So until we get a hold of that, and that's the same way in our communities. We see people breaking laws and we don't call the police on them because that's
snitching,
snitches get stitches. So culturally we need to fix that.
Yeah. So I think and not to cut you off, Ms. Carla, but Dr. Pitts, to your earlier point real quick, because I know we got a couple minutes before we wrap up, but to your point, and I know, Ms. Carla, I know you might have a reaction to this, but I just wanted to read this definition real quick. So by definition, an indentured servant is a person who signs and is bound by indentures to work for another for a specified time, especially in return for payment of travel expenses and maintenance.
I would agree with that.
It sounds like I just read a national letter of intent letter right there, because it says once you sign
agree
your name
with
on
that.
it. So indentured servant might sound a little bit better, but even just the name indentured servant, when I think of that, it's another way of saying slave without necessarily saying slave.
You get paid a little bit.
Yeah, so I think when we think of student athletes, especially at even at the high level, because like we said, only 2.3% of those student athletes at the Division I level for football and basketball go to the pros.
Mm-hmm.
So even at that high level, even at those schools where they have on average 110 players on their roster, out of 100 players, only 2 from that roster might go to the pros, and they might make it. So, when we're talking about this, I think, there are definitely some discrepancies and a lot of contradictions that the NCAA has portrayed over the decades and generally have gotten away with, because like we talked about earlier with these boundaries, how much power does a player really have in forms of, what I'm going to tolerate and what I'm not going to tolerate, because, and I'm pretty sure people have sat there and said with the NCAA tournament, oh, well, if they don't like those conditions, they should just boycott and not play. Ain't nobody telling them to play. Then what's the solution? Why do they have to be the ones that sacrifice their eligibility, their time, and their passion, because the institution who said, we're going to take care of you, we're going to provide you with this, that, and the third, and they don't do it? Why is it up to the players that have to take that moral high ground and hold these adults who they basically have their lives in their hands accountable?
But the NCAA tournament it now goes to the, I think, coaches and the institutions have to push.
Absolutely. And what do we see here? I didn't read the statistics off last week, but 92% of the athletic commissioner, the commissioners for these Power 5 conferences are white. 78% of the coaches are white. 92% of the university presidents of these Power 5 conferences are white. So here we are, where we have these teams who are majoritarily Black, where, they're being sold, and don't get me wrong, the entire team is being impacted, but at these schools, who is necessarily they coming to see? They're coming to see the Black student athletes at these schools perform at a high level. But when they're being subjected to unfair conditions based off what they've been sold and portrayed to in high school and stuff like that, of what you're going to get and the possibilities, it doesn't match up at all. And like we said, there has to be some solutions. I think the solution that I can think of right now that would be a start in the right direction is getting rid of the restriction of how long you have to be out of high school in order to go try your pros. And I know basketball has done this. I would like to see it with football. Basketball has done it to where you can commit to the NBA draft all the way up until I think they do it maybe a couple weeks before the draft, where if you feel like you're not going to get drafted or it ain't worth it, you don't lose your eligibility. You can come back, even though you've hired, I think you can hire an agent and train and stuff like that. But if you just feel like it's not going to work out, you can come back and try again. I would like to see that with football, but instead of making it 3 years, hell, make it 2. I think 20. I think being a 20-year-old football player, you've had 2 years to develop your body, because let's be real, a lot of high school players, they don't touch weights coming out of high school, especially the skilled positions like receivers, DBs, stuff like that. They don't touch weights. They're just God-gifted talent, running really fast, can catch the ball, all that type of stuff. So they don't really mature their bodies until they get to a college program. So I think that can be a step in the right direction. But clearly, this is a conversation that needs to be continued on a national level until we start to see some real consistent changes from the NCAA, if they have any type of chance of being relevant going into the next decade. Because at this point, I don't think they'll be really relevant very much longer.
I don't see it. I agree with you, Ronnie. I agree with every word that you're saying. They're not going to be relevant, especially you have kids going to Europe to play.
Yeah, absolutely.
High school.
Well, look, folks. Wow. just wow.
Great conversation, man. Great. And it's conversation that needs to continue. Definitely needs to continue.
And you know what? In actuality, we're going to continue it next week, because next week it's sports academics and inequality. So we're going to get, the
good old academia.
Yep. So we're going to be putting that, because it's spring. So graduation is creeping up on us real quick. We've already had these preliminary discussions about graduation rates of Black student athletes being down in comparison to white athletes and all of that. So we're going to get into that conversation hot and heavy next week. I said that I was going to interject throughout the show today about, asking yourself, who am I? Who do others say I am? And who do I pretend to be? Didn't do that because the conversation was so robust. But I definitely encourage everybody listening and viewing to ask themselves that question, because what that does is that it taps into your ability to get in touch with your authentic self. And when you're able to be in touch with your authentic self, you're better equipped to make well-informed decisions. And to that point, we're not saying here, we put disclaimers out all the time. We're not saying that we take a stance necessarily one way or the other on the topics that we're presenting to you week in and week out. Some of them we do, some of them we feel very strongly about. And we're certainly not saying that athleticism is slavery, but it's a hot topic, and it's one that's going to be debated, I believe, and we believe, for a really long time. So we wanted to put it out there to find out what you all thought. It's definitely something that folks need to be aware of as they are being recruited from high school, or even from high school, from high school for college play, or to go straight into the league. There are just some things that need to be understood. There's a biblical verse that says that my people perish for lack of knowledge. And I think that is one of the cultural issues among us as a people. I think that particularly, just for emphasis sake for a moment, particularly where poverty and lack of education is a contributing factor, I think that people tend too often, not all the time, but too often, to make decisions based on wrong or limited information. And that's why we pride ourselves here on HT Pregame in providing information so that people can make well-informed decisions. What we want our viewing and listening audience to understand is that you have to get clarity on these things. Don't just have, dollar signs dancing in your head at the thought of your kid getting a full athletic scholarship or even a partial athletic scholarship based on the notion that, oh, Johnny is so good, or Lil Hakeem, or Buff Quita, or Chanel, or whatever your baby name is, that they're going to the pro, and that's going to be your ticket out of poverty. Because as Ronnie said, there's a very, very, very small percentage of scholar athletes that go to the professional leagues. So you have to plan accordingly, and your ability to plan accordingly is going to be based on the amount of knowledge that you have. You cannot have tunnel vision when it comes to being a scholar athlete. And that's all we're saying. We're not saying that your child is a slave. We're not saying that your child is going to be a slave. What we're saying is that, particularly for those of you, and really for everybody, but I want to speak first to those who really think that your child is good enough to go into the league, you need to make sure that you have all of the appropriate information that you need. Because as Ronnie just said, for some of these schools, whether you're planning on sending your kid to an HBCU or to a PWI or another Power 5, there are some systems and measures in place that the Ncaa has in place that, guess what? If you're not well versed on Ncaa regulations, your child could get dinged, could lose their eligibility, and not even be able to play. Then what? But if you don't know this, if all you're worried about is, they going to sign this letter of intent, they going to college that we don't have to pay for, and you're making decisions without the appropriate amount of information. And we want to continue to reinforce that to you week after week. So look, folks, it's been yet again another great show. There's so much good stuff in the pipelines. We can't even begin to expound on it. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to check us out again tonight at 10 p.m. on Heritage Sports Radio Network, and tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Until next week, I'm Dr. Lauren Pitts, your sports mental health empowerment coach. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye-bye.